Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Masters of TESOL. On this episode we're going to talk about the slightly controversial idea that the native English model should not necessarily be the goal in the classroom. I know what you're thinking, but just uncross your arms for a second and just think about it. There are some valid reasons. For example, of all the English speakers in the world, native English speakers are actually a minority. For example, there's more people speaking English in China than in the United States. So we're going to look at English as a lingua franca, or ELF. Yes, I know, ELF. So I'll give you a minute just to get all those ELF jokes out of your system. No, it's okay, I can wait. Okay, done? Great. So our ELF queen is Professor
Jenkins,
who first broached the idea back in 2000. I spoke to her by a very unreliable Skype connection. So let's start with, what is English as a lingua franca?
So English as a lingua franca is basically, it's a very simple phenomenon. It's the way English is used among people who come from different first language backgrounds who choose to communicate with each other in English. It's a very common choice of language for people from different first language backgrounds. And sometimes it's the only choice they have. It's the only common language. It's not the only one. There are many other lingua francas, but it's the one with the most users. I mean, probably around 2 billion or more in the world.
Wow, okay.
Probably around a third of the world's population have some access to English.
So I guess looking at those numbers, that two people speaking English to each other, there's a very, very good chance they're actually both non-native speakers.
Yes, because I mean, I think it's around 5 to 1, 5 non-native speakers to 1 native.
Wow.
I mean, this isn't to say that you can't include native speakers in English as a lingua franca in the phenomenon, but it's quite unlikely that they will be there because of the numbers. But if they are there, the point is simply that their native speaker English is no longer seen as the sort of the one to aim for. They need to fit in with the way it's used as a lingua franca, which is quite often quite different from the native language.
So how did you develop the lingua franca core?
Well, I mean, what happened was I was an EFL teacher myself back in the 1980s. And, I was actually teaching in London. And my students came from all around the world. I mean, literally, they were from East Asia, they were from Southeast Asia, Latin America, Europe, all speaking English together. And I noticed that both in class and outside class, that although they generally learnt the rules that they needed to learn in order to pass things like Cambridge First Certificate and proficiency and so on, and then they weren't using English the way I was teaching them. All sorts of other things were happening. Suddenly they stopped using the uncountable nouns. They stopped using the articles with the 27 rules I taught them. They stopped putting an S on the third person singular in the present tense. They stopped saying the TH sound as I say it, and all sorts of things like that. And I noticed that they were doing this and actually getting on very, very well. But then they knew these rules, and in the tests, they got them right. And I started to think, well, what's going on here? And I started to look at what happened when they didn't understand each other and realize that they were very quickly working out how to adjust, particularly their pronunciation. If they said something and the other person looked back at them,
blankly,
as if they were mad, they realized and quickly adjusted. So they seemed to have a sort of intuitive sense, but they couldn't always do it. It depended on whether they actually had in their sort of phonological repertoire the ability to do this. I thought this was incredibly interesting, and that started to think these people are going to have international careers. They're going to be mixing in the future with many, many more non-native English speakers using English as a lingua franca than, trying to be like native speakers in England or wherever.
Right. Yes.
And, what with all the sort of talk about globalisation and English going hand in hand with globalisation, I thought, this is the future. And I decided to basically research what they're doing, how they're doing it. And I took pronunciation or accent as my focus, partly because I'm actually very interested in accent. I'm not a phonetician or anything like that, but I'm interested in accents and social implications of accents and so on, always have been. And also because accent was the most obvious thing. It's the most salient thing when you listen to somebody from somewhere other than where you come from. The first thing you notice is their accent. And the most noticeable thing in the classroom, say with 16 students, 20 students or whatever, was their different accents. And I thought this would be the most productive thing to research. So that's what I did. And out of that, I called it the Lingua Franca core. I have regretted that since, because
Really?
people have accused me of talking about a core of English and that it applies to everything, and that was not it. And it was never intended as a model. It was simply a group of features that seemed to emerge from my data collected over 5 years in a variety of settings, not only in classrooms, outside and at social events as well. And these were the things that seemed to be most often needed for people to be able to be intelligible in lingua franca communication.
Okay, so the absolute bare bones of understandable communication.
Yeah, so that they could understand each other. They didn't need them all the time. It depended who was talking to who. Or I should have said whom, I guess.
I'm sure somebody will tell you.
But it really depended. And also familiarity made a difference, who's familiar with whose accent. If both people come from languages where they don't have a w sound and they both do a v for a w, well, they don't need to change it. And what I found was they very quickly tune in to each other's accent and work out what they do and don't need to change. So virtually none of them needed to say a th sound, a th and a the. None of them bothered to do that. But there were other things they did, and this is where the idea of accommodation was very prominent in my research, the ability to adjust how you speak in order to make it easier for the person you're speaking to understand. And I found that actually they were pretty good at it, but it did need developing. It's a skill that needs developing.
Okay, so accommodation doesn't naturally happen?
Well, it is a natural thing, but some people are better at it than others.
Oh, okay.
And actually, it seems to be the native English speakers who are worse at doing it in Franca communication, because the assumption is always that everyone should be speaking English like we do, and why would we need to change? But again, some native speakers are better at it than others, but not necessarily those who have other languages.
Yeah. Well, do you think that the native norm, do you think it's still kind of ingrained even in teachers that the native norm is what to aim for?
It's very interesting, this whole thing. I mean, I have to say that, since I published my first book on ELF, actually, I called it English as an International Language then, because ELF, nobody had heard of this, and called it English as an International Language because, it just made people laugh when I stood up at conferences and talked about ELF. Right. A little pixie with a hat, green hat or something, it made people laugh. So I said English is an international language. But when I did that, it was very, very controversial when that first book came out. Some people really thought this was very exciting. An awful lot of people started to research it themselves and started to collect corpora of English as a lingua franca and so on. And it started a whole new wave of, somebody, Tim McNamara at Melbourne, the language assessment expert, has compared it to the communicative approach or communicative language teaching as much as of a revolution as that. Wow. That a lot of people saw the potential of this, but it was very controversial, particularly among teachers who had invested so much over the years in so much time, so much money in trying to make their English native-like. At first, it was really strongly resisted in the ELT profession, but it's gradually worked its way onto teacher training courses. It now features, if not always in a very sort of clear cut. It's often a bit illogical how they're doing it. They haven't quite grasped, understood what ELF is about, but it's there, it's appearing.
Oh, okay. What have they misunderstood?
Well, they still talk about ELF as if it's a variety of English. It's not. It's nothing like that. It's completely different from a variety. But to go back to your question, over the years, I think more teachers have got interested in it. And although because we don't have a lot of teaching materials and so on that they can use, they don't quite know what to do about it. People are now starting to talk about elf-aware teaching. So although they're not going to start teaching things like say a s or a z instead of a th, that would be silly, because we're not talking about a variety, a fixed variety, that this is elf and this is what you should teach. They're talking about being aware of how people use English when they're using it as a lingua franca, and learning to adjust how you speak, so that and write as well. People are talking about writing now as well, so that people can understand you easily.
Okay.
And so it's starting to find its way. Teachers, the more sort of forward-looking teachers, I guess, are now engaging with this. And of course, there's so much more published now on ELF that they can read that actually show them how they might incorporate an ELF-aware approach to English teaching.
So I guess from a teaching perspective, that because it's not a variety of English, I guess some teachers who are unfamiliar with it might think, well, what do I teach? Like, what is the...
Exactly. And this is where I have to say, I'm not an expert, although I was an EFL teacher back in the day, a long way back. I mean, my ex-PhD student, now a senior lecturer at King's College London, Martin Dewey, is probably the main expert on ELF pedagogy. But this is the problem. There is nothing that I'm aware of, though Martin might know some things, but I'm not aware of any teaching materials where there's any sort of clear advice on how you might incorporate an ELF approach. I mean, I have written sort of basic ideas that I've had in the past, but they go back some, probably to my 2007 book, English as a Lingua Franca, Attitude and Identity, where I looked at the controversy it had caused, and looked at the concerns that people had raised about this whole idea of English as a lingua franca, and how worried teachers especially were. And I interviewed a lot of teachers who they liked the idea very, very much. And they were all non-native English speaking teachers that I interviewed for that, and they really did like the idea, but they didn't want to do it. And they certainly didn't want to speak like, some non-native way of English speaking themselves.
What was at the root of that resistance, though?
I think it goes back to two things. One is the way they were taught English themselves in the classroom.
Okay.
It's very rule governed. This is right, this is wrong. If you get this wrong, you lose a mark. And the other is, in many, many cases, but I think language ideology is not restricted to English. If you go to many countries in the world, there's a very strong ideology about what is the acceptable version of the language. So in China, it's Putonghua Mandarin. In Spanish, there's obviously a very clear idea of what is good Spanish, and when you look at this, language ideology is a very deep-rooted thing. I mean, unfortunately, it's always established by those who are in power. It has nothing to do. It's nothing to do with what is intrinsically better or worse in different ways of using language. It's totally man or woman made, but actually mostly man, I have to say.
Well, that's it. We talked about the resistance from the teachers, but did you find any resistance from students about this?
When I did the research for the 2007 book, I didn't talk to students, but I did find that teachers talked a lot about their students, and a lot of other people have written about how patronizing it is to say they don't need native English. I haven't said that. All I said is give them a choice. At the moment, they don't have a choice. They might occasionally, but not in Britain, be offered a choice between British and American accents, but they're very rarely even offered that. I've said give them a choice. Tell them about the sociolinguistic reality of English in the world, which is, tell them about the numbers of non-native English speakers, tell them about how it's used as a lingua franca by so many people, tell them all this, and then once they're well informed, give them a choice. That's all we ever said, ELF researchers. We never said you now need to stop teaching native English, whether it's American, British, and teach ELF. And we continually said very early in the research trajectory, it was within the first few years we realized we absolutely couldn't talk about one kind of ELF, that it is very It's very dependent on context. It's very dependent on who's speaking to who and the ability to sort of tune in to the way people are speaking around you and adjust your English. You can't talk about correctness. In fact, Martin Dewey said in one of his publications that if you ask what is correct in relation to wealth, you're asking the wrong question, because we can no longer talk about correctness. We can talk about what is intelligible, what communicates, what is successful, what makes successful communication. And that doesn't relate to correctness against some native English model.
Do you think some teachers might resist it because it feels like it's taking away their power in the classroom?
Well, it's certainly for the native speaking English teachers. It's reducing their influence, yes, but on the other hand, it empowers non-native English teachers.
Okay, yes, true.
Who are the majority around the world. Okay, I think their objections have been that they have invested so much in trying to be native-like, but they must realise as well that in most cases they are not. You cannot sound native-like. They may write in a native-like way, quite a lot do, and nobody's suggesting they shouldn't do. They should suddenly stop that and try to find ways of changing their writing. No, it's fine to write in native-like ways, as long as it is internationally intelligible. But in terms of their speech, they're likely to have an accent that shows to some extent where they come from. Actually, one of my colleagues in ELF, Professor Anna Mauranen from the University of Helsinki, has created the term similect. I mean, it's something that we've been talking about for a long time, what an ELF user actually does. But she's the first to give it a really good name. And what it means is that wherever you come from in the world, if you're a non-native English speaker, when you use English, well, actually, it goes for native English speakers too, but if we concentrate on non-native English speakers, there will be some influence from your first language. So if you're, say, from South Korea, you're going to have, in your English, there will be some Korean influence in that English accent. Very unlikely that it will be completely erased. So you'll have some of that. So you'll have some similarity, this is the simi bit, with all other Koreans. When you speak English, you all have some common element. It may be different common elements. It won't all be the same because some of you will have more, some will have less Korean influence, but you'll all have some, or most of you will have some. But you don't develop your English by using it with each other, mostly. Mostly if you come from a country where English is not a native or an official language, used in daily, as you go about your daily life, you don't develop your English with each other. You develop your English in parallel with each other by talking with people from other first languages in English. So your English develops according to who you talk it with. So your English has some of your first language in it, but from there on, it develops differently from other people with that first language because it develops according to who you're mixing with when you speak English. So your English will have elements that are quite different. Some elements will be quite different from other people from your first language. And that's the whole notion. I think that sums up very neatly what it is about ELF. And that's why you can't talk about a variety, because when you think that this applies to people in every country, all developing with a bit of first language influence, but then a whole lot of unpredictable variables involved. And that's why ELF is, there's such a diverse population of ELF users that you can't fix it. You can certainly point to certain things that seem to be features of ELF that I don't like to talk about features because then people start to try to pin it down into, make it, fix ELF as one thing. There are certain things, but these seem to be probably more to do with language universals. These are things that I suspect would have happened if English had remained only a native language.
But for the kind of average ESL, EFL teacher, what can they take away from the ELF?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying about elf-aware teaching. I think it's very difficult these days, wherever you are in the world, to not be aware that English is being used as a lingua franca.
Yeah.
And I think that I wouldn't want to prescribe anything and say people should do this and shouldn't do that. And I think maybe the first step would be in a classroom would be to get people used to using English as a lingua franca. If you have the ability, it's difficult if you're in a classroom where everybody speaks the same first language. And when they get out into the wider world and start using English, I mean, presumably most of them will, and use English with people from other languages. As soon as they go to university, that's going to happen because, you know, most universities are doing some teaching in English medium these days. So they're going to meet international students who are from other countries. And as soon as they start that, they're going to develop, you know, the ability to communicate using English as a lingua franca. But if in classrooms, at least teachers could make their pupils, students aware of ELF, just aware of. I mean, they can play recordings. I mean, if you access some of the, say, a corpus like the Vienna Oxford International Corpus of English, which I think is available for free download on the University of Vienna website, there is a voice, it's V.O.I.C.E, neatly says voice. Which
clever.
was directed by Professor Barbara Seidelhofer, and you can download that. And admittedly, they're mainly Europeans in her data, but you can listen to lots of conversations, and they've got transcripts of a lot of them as well, and see how people are speaking when they use English as a lingua franca. People from different first languages, with a very tiny minority being native English speakers in these recordings. This is the kind of thing they're going to hear when they go out, when they go to university, or when they go out to work, if they work in English-speaking environments. Because if they stay in their own country, they're going to mostly be using the first language. But if they go anywhere else or work for international companies in their country, in their own country, then they are going to be experiencing this kind of communication. So I think, you know, doing awareness raising. Talking about accommodation skills, making sure people are able to adjust the way they use it. I mean, the lingua franca core, although you know, that I think most replications, when people have tried to copy that research and try it out again, mostly they found very similar things. And I think the things that, at least the things I've said, are not really important, probably aren't, so not too much focus on those. And the things that I've said may be important, maybe make sure people can do those things. They may need them, but they may not. I mean, I don't know. Depends who they talk with.
Exactly right. It's very contextual.
Yeah, that's the thing about ELF. It is very, very contextual. It's wherever you are in the world, whoever you're speaking with. It doesn't really matter where you are. It matters who you're speaking with. You know, there's as much ELF in the UK. You go to a UK university, any UK university, and you'll find masses and masses of ELF communication going on among students and increasingly teachers.
Wow, it's the new world.
It is absolutely, this is globalization of English, and English is not the English that we think of in the pre-globalization days. I mean, I find this all very exciting. I mean, some people find it frightening, I guess.
Right. So for people listening who want to find out more, what kind of further reading would you recommend?
If they want to really read sort of the more complex things, I mean, there's a book by Barbara Seidelhofer, called Understanding English as a Lingua Franca. That was published in 2011 by OUP. My own book that looked at attitudes, but is a bit more out of date now, English as a Lingua Franca, Attitude and Identity, published by OUP also in 2007. And the first one that talked about ELF, the one on accents, the phonology of English as an international language, also OUP 2000. Anna Marin, if you're interested in English for academic purposes, sort of academic English, she's published a book with Cambridge University Press. It's called Exploring ELF, Academic English Shaped by Non-Native Speakers. And that's where she talks first in writing about similex. That's very interesting. My own latest book, which is looking at ELF in the context of higher education, is called English as a Lingua Franca in the International University, published by Routledge, 2014. And there are quite a lot of journal articles by Martin Dewey, Dewey, including in the journal JELF, Journal of English as a Lingua Franca, where there's a lot of other very useful material. And he's probably the one that's talked most about teaching, ELF-aware teaching, how you might incorporate it into teaching and teacher training. But also, I think the little article I wrote in ELTJ in 2012, English as a Lingua Franca from the classroom to the classroom, I think that's quite a nice one for teachers to read, to give them a sort of, quite short, but a sort of idea of what it is and why it's important.
Okay, fantastic. So Jennifer Jenkins, thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So there you go, English as a Lingua Franca. I really encourage you to read up on it. It can really change the way you approach teaching. So please keep the tweets and emails coming in. So you can find me at MOTcast on Twitter or mastersoftsol.com. And if there's any area of teaching or any expert even that you want me to interview, then let me know and I'll try and track them down. Next episode we'll be looking at human cognition. So until then, see you later.